Big Shaq had no idea his quiet morning would change a life forever. When the basketball legend saw Natalie Quinn sitting alone on her birthday, lost in the weight of her past, he trusted his gut and stepped in. What started as a simple act of kindness unraveled a buried truth, a betrayal, and a fight for justice that had been silenced for too long. As shadows of the past rise again, one question remains. Will Big Shaq's help be enough to rewrite Natalie Quinn's story before it's too late? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal was a man of size, but his heart, that was even bigger. The world knew him as Big Shaq, a towering giant, a basketball legend, a millionaire with a laugh that could shake a room. But behind the fame, beyond the cameras and highlight reels, he was something else entirely. A man who never forgot where he came from. A man who knew the weight of struggle, the sting of injustice, and the quiet pain of being seen as something before being seen as someone. It was a warm spring morning in Atlanta, the kind where the air smelled like fresh pavement and hope. Shaq sat behind the wheel of his matte black SUV, waiting at a red light, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. He had no agenda today. No business meetings, no interviews, no celebrity appearances. Just an open day in his schedule, a rare thing for a man like him. But free time never felt empty. It always led him somewhere unexpected. As the light turned green, he drove through the familiar streets, past the towering glass buildings, the high-end restaurants, the designer boutiques, the kind of places where people lived in a different reality. But Shaq's eyes weren't drawn to the polished storefronts. He had always been more interested in the people outside those doors, the ones who didn't have a seat at the table. He had been one of them once. There was a time, long before the fame, before the championship rings and sneaker deals, when Shaquille O'Neal was just another kid in Newark. Life wasn't easy. His mother, Lucille, worked tirelessly to keep food on the table, teaching him that kindness wasn't a privilege, it was a responsibility. His stepfather, Philip Harrison, a military man, instilled discipline in him, showed him what it meant to carry himself with strength and dignity. But outside their home, the world wasn't always kind. Shaq was different, not just in size, but in presence. People stared, whispered, and sometimes worse. He had seen racism up close, had felt its sting in ways words couldn't fully capture. But instead of letting it harden him, it made him softer where it mattered. And maybe that was why, even now, decades later, with millions in his bank account and the world at his feet, he still looked for the ones who felt invisible, the ones left on the outside. Shaq pulled up to a small corner cafe, one of those spots where locals gathered for coffee and conversation. He liked places like this, unpretentious, real. He stepped out of the SUV, his massive frame instantly drawing attention. It always did. People nudged each other, whispered, some even pulled out their phones, hoping to catch a glimpse of the superstar in their midst. He smiled, nodding at a few fans, giving a quick dap to a teenager wearing one of his old Lakers jerseys. But inside, he sometimes wished he could move through the world unnoticed, just once. Being Big Shaq meant always being watched. People expected something from him. A joke, a handshake, a moment of his time. And most days, he gave it. But today, something felt different. As he ordered his usual black coffee and took a seat by the window, he let his mind drift. He had everything: money, respect, the kind of legacy most men dreamed of. But even with all that, there were days he felt a hollowness he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the people he had lost, his father, his sister. Maybe it was the way the world still felt divided, still bruised by the same hatred he had seen as a kid. Or maybe it was just the simple truth that no matter how much he gave, there was always more pain out there. And then he saw her. At a small table near the entrance, a woman sat alone, her shoulders hunched forward slightly, her fingers wrapped around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking. A folded-up wheelchair sat beside her, the metal frame catching the morning light. Shaq wasn't the kind of man who stared, but something about her stopped him cold. Maybe it was the way she was trying to hold herself together, like a dam on the edge of breaking. Maybe it was the way people around her weren't staring. Not because they didn't notice her, but because they chose not to. He knew that look. He had seen it too many times. The quiet grief of someone who had learned that the world rarely made room for them. The waitress came by, placing a small cupcake with a flickering candle in front of the woman. A birthday. She didn't move, didn't smile, just stared at the candle like it was some distant thing, separate from her, as if celebrating today felt like a betrayal of whatever pain she carried. Shaq felt something tighten in his chest. He had never been the type to ignore his instincts. Some people live by logic, others by strategy. Shaq, he followed his gut. It had never led him wrong. And right now, it told him to do something. He didn't know this woman, didn't know her story, didn't know why she was sitting alone on her birthday, why sadness clung to her like an invisible weight. But he didn't have to know to care. So he stood up. People watched as he moved across the cafe, his steps slow but certain. He didn't care. This wasn't for them. When he reached her table, he didn't sit, didn't intrude. He just looked down at her and spoke, his voice low and steady. "Happy birthday." The woman blinked, startled. For a moment, she looked up at him like she wasn't sure if she had imagined it. And then, without warning, her eyes filled with tears. Not the kind that come with gratitude. The kind that come when a wound is touched that has never fully healed. Shaq didn't look away. He had seen a lot in his life. Fame, fortune, the best and worst of humanity. But something about this moment felt different. And he had a feeling, one he couldn't shake, that today was about to change everything. The city of Atlanta pulsed with life, its streets alive with movement and noise, horns honking, people talking, the rhythmic clatter of high heels against the pavement. But in the middle of all that sound, there were quiet stories playing out, unnoticed and unseen. And on this particular morning, Shaquille O'Neal noticed one. His SUV rolled slowly through the downtown streets, sunlight reflecting off its polished exterior. The day was clear, warm, a gentle breeze tugging at the city's skyline. He had no real destination, just a rare, free day to be present in the world, without the constant pull of responsibilities. As he approached a red light near a small cafe, something caught his attention. A woman sat alone at a sidewalk table, her hands curled around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, her gaze distant, as if she wasn't really seeing the world around her. The weight of sadness was on her face, raw and unhidden. It was the kind of sorrow that didn't need sound to be understood. Beside her, folded neatly but unmistakably present, was a wheelchair. Shaq watched, his chest tightening. He wasn't sure why, but something about her struck him deeply. Maybe it was the way she sat so still while the world moved around her, or the way people walked past without even glancing her way. It wasn't just loneliness. There was something else, something heavier. The waitress stepped out of the cafe, carrying a small plate. She placed it in front of the woman with a soft smile, and Shaq saw the flickering candle standing in the center of a single cupcake, a birthday. And yet, there was no celebration in her expression, no moment of gratitude, no softening of her features, just a deep, lingering pain. Shaq shifted in his seat, his gut tightening. He had learned long ago to trust that feeling. The same instinct that had guided him on the court, the same intuition that had pushed him to take risks in business, was pulling him now. Don't ignore this. The light turned green. Shaq hesitated for only a moment before pulling to the side of the road. Inside the cafe, Natalie Quinn sat still, her fingers tightening around the ceramic mug in her hands. The warmth had long faded, but she held on to it anyway, as if letting go would mean acknowledging how truly alone she felt. The candle flickered in front of her, its tiny flame dancing with the slight breeze. 29 today. Another year of existing, of surviving, of being an afterthought in a world that had long stopped seeing her. She wasn't always like this. There was a time she had been unstoppable, a force of nature, someone who ran toward life instead of watching it pass her by. But all of that had changed in a single moment, a twist of fate so cruel it still felt like a nightmare she hadn't woken from. Now, she was here, alone, a stranger to the life she once had. The city around her moved too fast, People walking with purpose, cars speeding by, conversations blending into an indistinct hum. And not one person, not one, stopped. No one wondered why a woman sat alone on her birthday, why her eyes glistened with unshed tears, why she hadn't even bothered to blow out the candle. Except one. A shadow moved across her table, blocking the light. Natalie blinked, snapping out of her haze as she looked up. And then she froze. It was him. Shaquille O'Neal. At first, she thought she was imagining it. But no, it was real. He was real. Towering over her, his presence so massive it seemed to shrink the space around them. She had seen him before, of course. Who hadn't? He was larger than life, both in stature and in reputation. But seeing him in person, standing at her table with an expression that was neither pity nor curiosity, but something deeper, something sincere, it threw her completely. He didn't say anything at first. Didn't launch into some well-meaning speech or force a conversation. He just stood there, watching her the way no one else had. And for the first time in a long time, Natalie felt seen. Shaq wasn't a man who tiptoed around situations. He had always believed in directness, in stepping forward instead of hesitating. But in this moment, he knew instinctively that words weren't what she needed. Instead, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Natalie stiffened, her grip tightening on her mug. What was he doing? Celebrities didn't just sit down with random people on the street. They didn't stop their day for strangers. But here he was, looking at her with those deep, knowing eyes, and for the first time all day, she didn't feel invisible. Shaq glanced at the cupcake, the candle still burning. You gonna blow that out? His voice was low, even. Natalie blinked, surprised by the question. She looked at the tiny flame, then back at him. She hadn't planned to. Did it even matter? She let out a breath. What's the point? Shaq tilted his head slightly, considering her words. He didn't argue, didn't try to convince her otherwise. He just sat back in his chair, stretching out his long legs as he glanced around. Funny thing about birthdays, he said after a beat. People make a big deal out of them when you're a kid. Cake, presents, all that. But when you get older, they kind of stop meaning what they used to. He looked at her then, his gaze steady. Still, another year's another year. And that's something, right? Natalie let out a short, hollow laugh. Not always. Shaq watched her for a long moment. There was a story here, a heavy one. He could see it in the way she held herself, in the way her fingers trembled slightly as they rested on the table. He had been around enough pain to recognize it when he saw it. A gust of wind passed, and the candle flickered dangerously, the flame bending but not going out. Natalie stared at it, a strange tightness forming in her chest. Shaq's voice was softer when he spoke again. You know, people think just 'cause you got money, just 'cause you got success, that you don't know what it's like to feel lost. He exhaled, shaking his head. But lost don't care who you are. Don't care how tall you stand, how strong you think you are. Some days it still knocks you right on your ass. Natalie lifted her gaze, something shifting in her expression. For the first time, she didn't just see Shaquille O'Neal, the legend. She saw Shaq, the man. A man who, despite everything, understood. A lump formed in her throat. For months, she had been drowning in silence, in grief, in the feeling that no one could possibly comprehend what it was like to lose the life you once had. But this man, this complete stranger, had just put words to something she hadn't been able to say aloud. And suddenly, for the first time that day, she felt the faintest spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The wind came again, stronger this time, and the candle's flame finally gave out. Shaq nodded. There you go, he murmured. Happy birthday. And for the first time, Natalie let herself smile. The city moved around them, fast and indifferent, like an ocean of people too busy to notice anything beyond their own momentum. Cars zipped by, conversations blended into background noise, and life pressed forward without pause. But at that small cafe table, amidst the rush of Atlanta's morning, there was stillness. Shaq sat across from Natalie watching her, not in the way most people did, out of curiosity, out of discomfort, out of awkward pity. He was just there, his presence grounding, like a massive, unshakable force that made the world feel a little less chaotic. Natalie shifted in her seat, fingers lightly tracing the rim of her untouched coffee mug. She could feel his eyes on her, not intrusive but steady, waiting. For what, she didn't know. And the strangest thing? She didn't feel the usual urge to shrink away. She had spent years perfecting invisibility, learning how to disappear in plain sight, how to move through the world without taking up space. Because when people noticed her, it usually wasn't in a way that felt good. They saw the chair before they saw her. They saw weakness before strength. And more often than not, they saw a reminder of something they didn't want to think about. Natalie had learned, through experience, that people weren't cruel out of malice. No, their cruelty came from something worse: discomfort. The world didn't like to be reminded that life could change in an instant, that fate could be unfair, that some things didn't heal, no matter how much you wished they would. She had stopped expecting kindness a long time ago, which made Shaq sitting here, watching her, saying nothing but not looking away, feel like something foreign, something she wasn't sure how to process. Shaq knew what it was like to be seen before he was understood. He had been a giant kid in a world that didn't know what to do with him. Too big for normal desks in school, too awkward to blend in. People had looked at him with either fear or fascination, and in both cases, it made him feel like he was something to be observed instead of someone to be known. He had learned to carry it well, had even turned it into his greatest strength, but he never forgot the weight of it. And now, sitting across from Natalie, he recognized something in her posture, in the way she kept her hands tight in her lap, in the way she flinched slightly whenever someone passed too close to her table. She was waiting to be dismissed. Shaq leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You hungry?" he asked, breaking the silence. Natalie blinked, caught off guard. She hesitated. "I don't think so." Shaq shrugged. "That's cool. I'm starving, though." Without waiting for an answer, he waved down the waitress and ordered a couple of things off the menu. Not expensive, not extravagant, just normal food like two people grabbing breakfast together. Natalie didn't stop him. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because for once someone wasn't making a big deal out of what she needed. As they waited for the food, Shaq found himself watching more than just Natalie. He watched the world around her. A man exited the cafe, nearly knocking into her wheelchair without acknowledging it. Two teenage girls walked by, sneaking a glance at her before quickly looking away, as if the sight of her made them uncomfortable. A waiter passed by their table and asked Shaq if everything was okay. Not Natalie, not them as a pair. Just Shaq, as if she weren't really there. It was subtle. No outright cruelty, no blatant rudeness, just a series of tiny, cutting dismissals. Shaq felt something deep in his chest tighten. If this was one morning, 1 hour in Natalie's life, how many moments like this had she endured? How many times had she been treated as less than whole? He had grown up dealing with prejudice, with the way people assumed things about him based on his size, his skin, his presence. But there had always been ways to push back. He could step forward, take up space, change their perception through his actions, his success, his power. Natalie didn't get that choice. She was stuck in a world that moved too fast to notice her, and Shaq hated that. The food arrived, and Shaq dug in like he hadn't eaten in days. Natalie watched him, lips twitching slightly as he demolished a stack of pancakes in record time. "You eat like someone's about to take your food away," she murmured. Shaq grinned, mouth full. "Comes from having 4 siblings. You eat fast, or you don't eat at all." She smirked, the first real hint of amusement on her face. He nudged a plate toward her. "Go on, you don't gotta pretend you're not hungry." After a beat, she picked up a fork. It was such a small thing, such an insignificant moment in the grand scheme of life. But to Shaq, it felt important. It felt like something shifting, like a wall that had been up for too long starting to crack. They might have sat there for a while, eating in comfortable silence, if not for what happened next. A group of men entered the cafe, their voices loud and careless, their energy shifting the mood of the place the moment they walked in. They were young, dressed sharp, the kind of guys who thought they owned the space around them. At first, they didn't even notice Natalie. But then one of them, a man with slicked back hair and a too expensive watch, caught sight of the wheelchair. And then the joke started. Shaq heard it before Natalie did. A low, muttered comment. Then a laugh. Then another. Natalie's entire body stiffened. Her hand clenched around her fork, her gaze dropping to the table. She had heard it too. Shaq's jaw tightened. He had spent his whole life being a public figure. He had learned patience, had learned to let a lot of things roll off his back. But this was different. The man leaned into his friend, louder now, making sure they were heard. Damn shame, huh? Imagine being stuck like that. Life over before it even started. More laughter. Natalie shrank in her seat. Shaq didn't move, not at first. But then, without a word, he reached for his coffee cup and turned toward them, his massive frame blocking Natalie from their view. The air in the cafe shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. The easy arrogance in the men's postures faltered when they realized who they were standing next to. Shaq's gaze was calm, even, but there was a weight to it, a warning. Silence stretched. The men looked at each other. Then, like cowards, they muttered something under their breaths and backed away, choosing to sit at a different table. Natalie let out a slow breath. Shaq didn't say anything, didn't make a big deal out of it. He just turned back to her and reached for another bite of food. It was a small moment, but Natalie realized then, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. The cafe's atmosphere had changed. The tension still hung in the air, unspoken but heavy, like an invisible force pressing against the walls. The men who had mocked Natalie sat in the corner now, their voices lower, their laughter subdued. They had backed off, not because Shaq had threatened them, but because he hadn't needed to. His presence alone had been enough. But the moment wasn't over. Shaq glanced at Natalie, expecting maybe a sigh of relief, maybe a quick smile to brush off the ugliness of what had just happened. Instead, she looked smaller. Not physically. No. She was already petite compared to him. But in the way she carried herself, in the way her shoulders curled inward, in the way her fingers dug into the edge of the table like she was bracing for something. Not fear. Resignation. And that hit him harder than any insult ever could. Natalie wasn't just hurt by the comment. She wasn't even surprised by it. Shaq had seen plenty of things in his lifetime: racism, ignorance, disrespect. But nothing stung quite like watching someone expect to be treated like they were less. It was the way she had shrunk the second those words were spoken. The way she had instinctively tried to disappear, as if that was the only way to keep herself safe. As if she had done it 1,000 times before. Shaq leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the table. That happened a lot? Natalie hesitated. Then finally she lifted her gaze to meet his. You mean the stares? The whispers? The damn shame comments? A humorless smile crossed her lips. Yeah, it happens. Pretty much every time I leave the house. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. He had felt the sting of judgment before, had heard the whispers when he was just a kid, too big, too black, too different. But he had always had ways to fight back. Sports, his personality, his ability to push past expectations and prove them wrong. What did Natalie have? The world wasn't built to prove her right. He glanced at her folded wheelchair, at the chipped paint on the metal frame. It was well worn, well used. A part of her existence that most people probably noticed before they noticed her. How long? His voice was quiet but steady. She looked at him, confused. How long what? He nodded toward the chair. Natalie's jaw tightened. For a moment he thought she might shut down completely, but then she let out a slow breath. 4 years. Shaq didn't ask what happened. He could tell by the way she looked away, by the way her fingers tensed against the table, that it wasn't a story she handed out freely. And that was fine. He wasn't the type to pry. But something about the way she said it, 4 years, made him think it hadn't just been 4 years of being in that chair. It had been 4 years of something else entirely. Shaq had seen a lot of people lose things, money, careers, opportunities, but nothing compared to watching someone lose themselves. It had happened to guys he played with, athletes who had been on top of the world one day, then sidelined by an injury the next. Some of them bounced back. Some of them found purpose elsewhere. But others just faded. They didn't know how to exist outside of what they once were. They let the world's pity eat them alive. They let themselves believe that because something had been taken from them, there was nothing left to give. And Shaq hated that. Not because it made them weak, but because he knew that life didn't end when things changed. It just shifted. Natalie was still sitting in that shift, trying to figure out if she even existed in this version of herself. And he wasn't sure why, but something about that made him angry. Not at her, at the world, at how easily people discarded others once they didn't fit into the perfect mold, at how someone like Natalie, who clearly had fire inside her, had been forced into the background. And for the first time in a long time, Shaq felt something he hadn't expected today. A need to do something. Natalie stared at her plate, pushing a few crumbs around with her fork. Shaq let the silence hang for a moment before he spoke again. "You work?" She snorted. "I used to." Shaq raised a brow. "Used to?" A flicker of something crossed her face. Frustration, anger, but not at him. She let out a slow breath. "I had a good job before. I was a photographer. Worked with sports teams, actually. Traveled, covered big events. But after the accident, I don't know. People just stopped hiring me." Shaq frowned. "Why?" Natalie scoffed, shaking her head. "I don't know. Maybe they thought I couldn't handle it anymore. Maybe they thought I was too much of a liability. Maybe they just didn't want to deal with the inconvenience of hiring someone in a chair." She gave him a tired smile. "Doesn't really matter, does it? The result's the same." Shaq didn't like that answer. He didn't like how easily she said it, like she had already accepted it as fact, like she had stopped fighting. And that's when he knew. He wasn't walking away from this, not from her, not from this moment. Because if there was one thing Shaq O'Neal didn't do, it was stand by and watch potential get buried. Shaq didn't speak right away. He just sat there, thinking. Then finally, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "All right," he said simply. Natalie blinked. "All right? What?" He shrugged. "You need a job? You got one." She froze. For a second, she looked like she thought he was joking, like this was some cruel setup, a way to raise her hopes just to let them crash back down. But when she met his eyes, she saw nothing but sincerity. A beat passed. Then another. Finally, she huffed out a laugh, shaking her head. "You don't even know me." Shaq grinned. "Don't need to." Natalie narrowed her eyes. "And what exactly am I supposed to do?" Shaq leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "You said you used to be a photographer, right?" She nodded cautiously. "Well, I still got a lot of connections in the sports world. Plenty of teams, plenty of events. I can get you back in." His expression turned serious. "Only if you want to, though." Natalie opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked completely thrown, like her brain was struggling to process what was happening. Because it was insane, right? A man like Shaquille O'Neal sitting at a random cafe, offering a stranger a chance to restart her career? That didn't happen. Except, it just had. Her throat tightened. "Why?" Shaq tilted his head. "Why not?" She let out a breathless laugh. "That's not an answer." He shrugged. "Neither is giving up." Natalie stared at him, her chest tight, her emotions a tangled mess of disbelief, hope, and fear. She had spent 4 years being told no. 4 years being pushed aside, forgotten. And now, out of nowhere, this man, this absolute legend of a man, was offering her something she hadn't even allowed herself to hope for anymore. A way back, a way forward. She swallowed hard. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over yet. Shaq sat back in his chair, arms crossed, watching Natalie as she processed what he had just offered her. He could see it all, the doubt, the hesitation, the battle raging in her head. It wasn't just about the job. It wasn't even about the opportunity. It was about trust. And Natalie Quinn didn't trust easily. She had been let down too many times, ignored too often, and overlooked more times than she could count. The idea that someone, especially someone like him, would sit across from her and casually throw a lifeline? It made no sense. So when she finally spoke, her voice was edged with wariness. You really think it's that easy? Shaq didn't blink. Yeah, I do. She let out a breath, shaking her head. People don't just do this. They don't offer strangers a way back into the world for no reason. Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Maybe they don't, but maybe they should. Natalie studied him, as if trying to find the catch. She had spent years learning that help always came with conditions. There was always an expectation, always a price to pay. And yet, something about him felt different. She didn't know if that made it better or worse. Shaq glanced at his watch and stretched his massive frame. You got plans today? Natalie gave him a flat look. You mean besides sitting here, contemplating the cosmic joke that is my life? No, not really. Good. Shaq stood up. Come on. Her brows furrowed. Come on. Where? He gestured toward the street. Birthday adventure. Let's go. Natalie blinked. Birthday adventure? That sounded ridiculous. And yet, when she opened her mouth to protest, nothing came out. Because the truth was, she hadn't had an actual birthday in years. Not one that mattered. Not one that felt like anything other than another day she had to get through. But the idea of going anywhere with Shaq? That felt dangerous in a way she didn't understand. I don't think that's a good idea, she finally said. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Why not? She exhaled. Because people like you don't hang out with people like me. Because this is weird. Because you're scared, Shaq finished. Natalie's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm not scared. Shaq smirked. Yeah, you are. But that's okay. We'll work on that. He moved toward the curb, waiting for her to decide. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she found herself rolling toward him instead of away. The sun was bright overhead as they moved through the city. Shaq walked slow, adjusting his long strides to match the pace of Natalie's wheelchair. It was a small thing, but she noticed. People noticed them too. Not just because of Shaq's massive presence, but because they were an odd pair. A man who had the world in his hands, and a woman who felt like the world had left her behind. They passed by boutiques, street performers, food vendors. Shaq stopped at a hot dog cart, ordering one for himself and one for Natalie without asking. She gave him a look as he handed it to her. You really think I eat hot dogs from random street vendors? He shrugged, taking a massive bite of his. Guess we're about to find out. She stared at him for a long moment before reluctantly taking a bite. It was good. She hated that he was right. They kept moving, the conversation light. But Shaq was watching. He saw the way she tensed whenever they passed a group of laughing friends. The way her fingers gripped the wheels of her chair, just a little tighter, when she looked at shop windows, as if seeing reflections of a life she no longer had. And he saw the way her gaze lingered on a family across the street. A father holding a little girl on his shoulders, a mother laughing beside them. Natalie quickly looked away, but Shaq caught it. He didn't say anything, didn't press, but he filed it away. There was something about today, something about this birthday, that wasn't just hard. It was a wound. After an hour of wandering, Shaq suddenly turned a corner and stopped in front of an unassuming building with large, dark windows. Natalie looked up at the sign and froze. It was a photography studio. Her stomach clenched. Shaq, she said carefully. What is this? He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You used to do this, right? Before everything? Natalie's jaw tightened. Yeah, so what? So, I figured you might want to step inside and see what it feels like again. Natalie swallowed hard. I can't. Shaq's expression didn't change. Why not? She shook her head, looking away. Because that part of my life is over. Shaq crouched down slightly so their eyes were level. Or maybe you just convinced yourself it is. She exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling up. You don't get it. It's not just about the chair, it's about everything. My hands aren't as steady, my balance is off. People don't take me seriously. It's not the same. Shaq nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Then he reached out and tapped her wheelchair lightly. This thing, he said, It's a part of you, but it ain't you. Natalie clenched her jaw, emotions tangled. She wanted to argue, wanted to push back, but some part of her, the part that still missed holding a camera, still missed the rush of capturing a perfect shot, was screaming at her to listen. Shaq straightened. Look, I'm not saying you gotta go in, but I'm just saying, you don't gotta be scared to. The door was right there. A door she never thought she'd stand in front of again, and Shaquille O'Neal was standing next to it, waiting. Before she could decide, Shaq's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. His expression changed. Natalie frowned. What is it? Shaq hesitated. It was a call from his business manager, about a deal he had been negotiating for weeks, a deal worth millions. And he had 10 seconds to decide, answer, or let it go. Natalie watched him. If you have to take it, go ahead. Shaq looked at her, then at the studio door. Then, slowly, he silenced the call. Natalie's eyes widened. That was important, wasn't it? Shaq shrugged. Not as important as this. Natalie stared at him. No one had ever done that for her before. No one had ever chosen her. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something she thought was gone forever. Hope. She took a deep breath. Then, without a word, she rolled forward and pushed open the door. The air inside the photography studio was thick with memories. The faint scent of old film, inked contracts, and freshly brewed coffee clung to the walls like ghosts of the past. Light filtered through the tall windows, casting a glow on the polished wooden floors. Natalie hesitated just inside the entrance, her fingers gripping the wheels of her chair a little too tightly. She used to live in places like this. Studios, arenas, press boxes. The places where she wasn't just a spectator but a creator. A force behind the lens. But now she was just a woman staring at a life that felt a million miles away. Shaq stepped in behind her, his massive frame filling the doorway, his presence both grounding and overwhelming. He didn't speak. He didn't push. He just waited. And somehow that was worse. Because without his voice breaking the silence, all Natalie had left were her thoughts, and the truth she had spent 4 years trying to bury. A man in his late 50s approached from the back of the studio, his face lighting up when he saw Shaq. Well, damn. Didn't expect to see you walk through my doors today. Shaq grinned and gave the man a firm handshake. Gotta keep you on your toes, Phil. Phil Davis. One of the best sports photographers in the business. A legend behind the camera. He had been around long before social media turned everyone with an iPhone into a photographer. Natalie knew him well. Phil's gaze shifted, his smile faltering when he saw her. His eyebrows knitted together, recognition flickering behind his eyes. Natalie Quinn? His voice carried equal parts surprise and hesitation. She swallowed hard. Hey, Phil. For a beat, he just stared at her, taking in the wheelchair, the weight in her eyes, the way she looked like a ghost of the girl he used to know. Then, carefully, he said, It's been a long time. Natalie nodded. Yeah, it has. Phil gestured toward the back. Come on, let's catch up. Natalie followed, rolling slowly through the familiar space. Shaq walked beside her, feeling the tension crackling in the air. They settled into a corner of the studio, where old cameras and framed magazine covers lined the walls. Phil leaned against a desk, arms crossed. So, what brings you here? Natalie opened her mouth, but no words came out. Shaq spoke instead. She's getting back in the game. Phil's eyebrows shot up. Is that so? Natalie wanted to say yes. She wanted to feel like this moment was real, like this was her reclaiming something she had lost. But all she felt was the weight of the truth. She let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the arms of her chair. I don't know if I can. Phil studied her carefully. Why not? And just like that, the floodgates cracked open. Natalie swallowed hard. Because the last time I was behind a camera was the day my life ended. Shaq stiffened. Phil's face darkened. Natalie. She shook her head. I never told anyone what really happened. Shaq leaned forward. You don't have to. I do. Her voice was firm, but there was a tremble beneath it. Because I need to say it out loud. I need someone to know. Phil exhaled. Shaq stayed silent. Natalie let her gaze drift to the framed photographs on the wall. Athletes in motion. Victory, defeat, raw emotion frozen in time. She used to be part of that world. 4 years ago, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I had the biggest opportunity of my career. A chance to work for one of the biggest sports media outlets in the country. They flew me out to Denver for an exclusive player shoot before the season started. Shaq listened, his jaw tight. Natalie's grip on her chair tightened. I was excited, nervous, but more than anything, I was ready. This was my shot. She swallowed hard. I got to the training facility early. I wanted to scope out the location, get the perfect angles. I was setting up my equipment on the upper level of the gym when she stopped. Her breath hitched. Shaq leaned forward, his deep voice steady. Take your time. She inhaled sharply. There was a sound, a loud crack, and then the floor beneath me just disappeared. Phil closed his eyes. Shaq's hands curled into fists. I fell. Hard. Natalie's voice was eerily detached, like she was talking about someone else. It was an old section of the facility. No one had been up there in years. They never checked it, never reinforced it. And when I stepped in the wrong place, she let out a hollow laugh. The universe made the decision for me. Silence. Shaq exhaled through his nose. Jesus. Phil looked away. I remember hearing about an accident at that facility, but I never knew it was you. Most people don't. Natalie let her head rest against the chair's back. I was in the hospital for months. Spinal injury. They told me the damage was permanent. Shaq felt something deep in his chest tighten. Natalie looked away. And just like that, I wasn't Natalie Quinn, the photographer, anymore. I was just the girl in the chair. Shaq ran a hand over his face. That's messed up. Natalie nodded. Yeah, but you know what's worse? Shaq's brows furrowed. Natalie exhaled. I wasn't the first person to fall through that floor. Phil's head snapped up. What? Shaq leaned forward. What do you mean? Her expression darkened. A maintenance worker fell in the same spot 3 months before I did. He broke his hip, sued the facility. They paid him off, covered it up. Shaq's stomach twisted. They knew, Natalie whispered. They knew it was unsafe. They knew someone else had already gotten hurt. And they still let me walk up there. The weight of her words hit like a truck. Phil's face was pale. Natalie, why didn't you say anything? She let out a bitter laugh. Because I signed a contract. Because their lawyers made sure I got a nice fat settlement that kept my mouth shut. And because I was too broken to fight. Shaq exhaled sharply. He had seen corruption before, had seen people get screwed over by the system. But this was different. This was personal. Shaq looked at Natalie, at the weight she had carried alone for 4 years. And suddenly, this wasn't just about getting her back behind a camera. This was about justice. He straightened in his chair, his expression unreadable. Who was the facility owned by? Natalie hesitated. Shaq, it's not who. His voice was low, steady. She met his gaze, and finally she said the name. Shaq's entire body tensed. Because he knew that name, knew the man behind it. And for the first time in a long time, Shaquille O'Neal felt something burn in his chest that had nothing to do with charity or kindness. It was a promise. He wasn't just helping Natalie anymore. He was going to make this right. The weight of Natalie's confession still lingered between them, thick and heavy, like the air before a storm. Shaq had heard plenty of unfair stories in his lifetime, had seen the ways power could twist the truth and bury people beneath it. But this wasn't just injustice. This was betrayal. And he couldn't shake the thought. How many other Natalies had there been? How many people had been pushed aside, their pains smothered under non-disclosure agreements and settlements that silenced the truth? Natalie had lost everything that day. Her career, her confidence, her independence. And the men responsible? They were still out there, still making money, still living their lives like none of it had ever happened. That didn't sit right with him. And for the first time in years, Shaq knew his money wasn't the answer. This wasn't about a paycheck. It was about giving her back something she thought was gone forever. Shaq glanced at the time, 7:12 p.m. If he was going to pull this off, he had to move fast. He turned back to Natalie, who was watching him carefully. She looked exhausted, like unearthing her past had drained whatever energy she had left. "I gotta make a stop," he said suddenly. "Come with me." Natalie blinked. "What? Where?" Shaq just grinned. "It's a surprise." Her expression immediately hardened. "Yeah, no thanks. I don't do surprises." Shaq chuckled. "You didn't do birthday adventures either, and look where we are." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Shaq, I don't... You trust me?" His voice was steady, no pressure, just a quiet challenge. She hesitated. Did she? It had been a long time since she had trusted anyone with anything real. But Shaq was different. And maybe, just this once, she could let herself believe that. She exhaled sharply. "Fine. But if this turns out to be a disaster, I reserve the right to say I told you so for the rest of time." Shaq grinned. "Deal." The ride was quiet at first. Natalie kept stealing glances at him, trying to figure out what he was planning. Shaq just drove, his hands firm on the wheel, his mind racing. He had one shot at this, one shot to give her something she couldn't buy, couldn't fight for, couldn't even ask for, something that had been taken from her. They pulled up to a private building, tucked away from the busy streets of Atlanta. The parking lot was empty except for a handful of cars. The sign on the door was faded, almost easy to miss. Natalie squinted at it. "What is this place?" Shaq cut the engine and turned to her. "Come find out." She let out an exaggerated sigh. "If this is some elaborate attempt to get me to eat more street food, I swear. Just trust me." With that, he stepped out and walked around to help her. Natalie rolled her eyes but followed, her curiosity outweighing her skepticism. The moment she rolled inside, she froze, because she knew exactly what this place was. An indoor photography studio. But not just any studio. This was a full production setup. State-of-the-art cameras, lighting rigs, editing bays. The kind of space used for high-end commercial shoots. Natalie's hands clenched. This wasn't a nostalgic visit. This was a test. She turned to Shaq, her heart hammering. "Shaq, what?" Before she could finish, a voice called out from across the room. "Damn. Thought I was getting pranked when I got this call." Natalie whipped her head around and felt her breath catch. Because standing there, grinning at her, was Elijah King, one of the most respected sports photographers in the country. A man she had idolized for years before her accident. A man she had dreamed of working with before everything fell apart. Her voice came out in a whisper. "No way." Shaq smirked. "Way." Elijah walked over, arms crossed. "Shaq tells me you still got an eye for this." Natalie felt like she might be sick. Her stomach twisted, her hands itched, her mind screamed at her to run. I haven't done this in years," she admitted, voice barely audible. Elijah nodded, looking around the room. "All right, so let's fix that." Natalie blinked. "What?" Shaq leaned in. "Time to get back behind the lens, Quinn." Her heart pounded. She wasn't ready. She wasn't good enough anymore. She wasn't. But then Elijah placed a camera in her lap. Heavy, familiar, real. And suddenly, the world stopped spinning so fast. Her fingers hesitated before curling around the camera body. It was different from the one she had last used. But not different enough. She lifted it instinctively, adjusting the focus, feeling the weight settle against her palm. It felt natural. It felt like breathing. Shaq watched in silence, holding his breath as Natalie rolled forward for the first time. She lifted the camera, aimed, and clicked the shutter. A simple shot. Nothing extravagant. But when she looked at the screen, at the crisp image staring back at her, she felt something break open inside her. A dam. A wall. A belief she had carried for 4 years that said, "This part of me is dead." Because it wasn't. It never had been. Shaq grinned. "Told you." Natalie let out a shaky laugh. She couldn't believe this was happening. Couldn't believe how much she had missed this. But just as the moment settled, her phone buzzed. She frowned, pulling it from her pocket. The number was one she hadn't seen in a long time. And when she answered, the voice on the other end sent ice through her veins. "Hello, Natalie. Been a while." Her breath hitched. Shaq noticed the change immediately. "What's wrong?" Natalie swallowed, gripping the phone tighter. Because the voice belonged to someone she never wanted to hear from again. The man who had once told her to take the settlement and disappear. The man who had let her fall. And now? He knew she was standing up again. "Funny thing," the voice continued, smooth, careful. "Heard you've been poking around places you don't belong. Thought we had an agreement." Natalie's grip tightened. Shaq saw the way her expression shifted, from fear to something colder, something like determination. She ended the call. Shaq raised a brow. "Friend of yours?" Natalie's voice was quiet, but steady. "No." She looked up, her hands steady on the camera. "Just a man who's about to wish he never met me." The studio lights cast a warm glow around them, but the moment had turned ice cold. The call had ended, but the words still echoed in Natalie's ears. "Thought we had an agreement." She stared at the phone screen, her fingers tightening around it. The past was no longer creeping in. It had crashed through the door, demanding to be acknowledged. Shaq studied her closely. He had seen a lot of emotions in his lifetime: anger, pain, regret. But the look in Natalie's eyes was something different. Determination laced with quiet fury. He leaned forward. "Who was that?" Natalie inhaled sharply, debating how much to say. Then, in a voice that carried more steel than before, she whispered, "The man who made sure I disappeared." Shaq had spent enough time around powerful men to know when someone had something to hide. He knew the way influence worked. The way people pulled strings, erased mistakes, made problems go away before the world could see them. But what had happened to Natalie? This was different. She hadn't just been ignored. She had been silenced. And now the people who had buried her knew she wasn't staying buried. "You gonna tell me what's going on?" Shaq's voice was low, calm, but there was an edge to it now. Natalie looked at him, then at Elijah, who was standing quietly, watching the exchange with careful eyes. She exhaled. "I told you about the settlement," she said. "What I didn't tell you is that I wasn't the one who wanted it." Shaq frowned. "What do you mean?" Natalie's voice was tight. "I wanted to fight. I wanted to sue. I wanted the world to know what happened." She swallowed hard. But someone close to me didn't. There it was. The betrayal. Elijah's expression darkened. "Who?" Natalie hesitated. Then finally she spoke the name. "My brother." Shaq's jaw clenched. "Your brother?" Natalie nodded, her fingers curling into a fist. "Eric was my legal guardian after the accident. I was in the hospital, drugged up, barely able to process what had happened, and before I even knew what was going on. He signed the deal." Shaq exhaled slowly. "He sold you out." Natalie's lips pressed together. "He told me it was for my own good, that I'd never win, that I was just going to make my life harder by fighting a battle I couldn't win." Her voice cracked. "He said I needed to move on." Elijah ran a hand over his face. "Damn." Shaq leaned back in his chair, staring at her. "And now that you're making noise again, he's trying to stop you?" Natalie nodded, her jaw tightening. That's what that call was, a warning. The weight of it settled in the air between them. Shaq had never met Eric Quinn, but he knew men like him. Men who thought they were doing the right thing by keeping their hands clean. The kind of men who let money and fear dictate their actions instead of what was right. And Shaq had never been afraid of a fight. "I'm guessing he's not going to take this well," Shaq said. Natalie let out a dry laugh. "That's an understatement." Elijah exhaled. "What's the move then? You going to go public?" Natalie hesitated. "I don't know." And that was the truth. For years she had believed that this fight had already been lost, that her story had already been written. But now she was sitting in a photography studio with a camera in her hands, remembering who she used to be. And she had two choices. She could let fear dictate her life, Or she could take back the pen and rewrite the damn ending. Shaq leaned forward, his massive hands clasped together. Look, I get it. This isn't just about calling out some corrupt executives. This is personal. Natalie nodded. Yeah, it is. But let me ask you something, Shaq said. If it weren't, if this was someone else, someone who got hurt the way you did, who got silenced the way you did, what would you tell them? Natalie's throat tightened. She didn't even have to think about it. She would tell them to fight like hell. She would tell them that their story mattered, that they mattered. And suddenly, she felt it. The shift. The moment where fear stopped feeling like a cage and started feeling like fuel. She looked up at Shaq, her eyes blazing. I think it's time people knew what really happened. Shaq grinned. That's what I wanted to hear. Elijah cleared his throat. All right, well, if you're really gonna do this, you better be ready. Because once this gets out, they're gonna come for you. Natalie smirked. Let them. But Shaq wasn't smiling, because he knew what was coming. This wasn't just about telling the truth. This was about going up against powerful men who didn't like being exposed. And money wasn't going to fix it. Shaq had faced plenty of challenges in his life. He had battled on the court, built businesses, given back to his community. But this was different. Because this wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure Natalie didn't lose. And for the first time that night, Shaq wondered, was fate already written, or could he really change it? The city lights shimmered against the black night sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets of Atlanta. It was close to midnight now, but neither Shaq nor Natalie seemed to care. The day had been long, unpredictable, life-changing in ways neither of them could have expected. Shaq had spent his entire career winning battles on the court, but what had happened today, what he had seen, what he had learned, was bigger than any championship he had ever won. And Natalie? For the first time in 4 years, she wasn't just existing. She was fighting. The weight of her past, the fear, the betrayal, the belief that her story had ended. It wasn't gone, but it no longer controlled her. She glanced at the time on her phone, 11:48 p.m., 12 more minutes. 12 minutes before this day, the strangest, most painful, most unexpected best day she had had in years, was over. And somehow, she didn't want it to end. They sat on a quiet rooftop patio, overlooking the city. Shaq had taken her here. One last stop before midnight. It wasn't a fancy restaurant, wasn't a grand party. It was just them, the skyline, and the soft hum of the world below. Natalie wrapped her fingers around the warm cup of hot chocolate Shaq had placed in front of her, letting the steam rise against her face. She smirked. Not gonna lie, O'Neal, when you said birthday adventure, I didn't expect it to involve a lawsuit and an existential crisis. Shaq chuckled, stretching his long legs in front of him. Yeah, well, I like to keep things interesting. She shook her head. You really do. A pause. Then softer, she added. Thank you. Shaq turned toward her. For what? She exhaled, staring at the city lights. For everything. For stopping at that cafe. For not treating her like she was broken. For reminding her that she was still here. For today, she finally said. For not letting me disappear. Shaq didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he grinned. Wasn't gonna let that happen. She let out a small laugh. Yeah, I figured. The clock ticked closer to midnight. Natalie let her gaze drift back to her phone, to the last missed call from her brother. Eric hadn't called again, hadn't sent a message. But she knew it wasn't over. People like him, people who played the game in the shadows, didn't just walk away. And yet, for the first time since that accident, she wasn't afraid. She placed the phone face down on the table and looked at Shaq. I'm doing this, she said. I'm telling my story. Shaq studied her carefully. He had seen that look before. Not in her, but in every great fighter he had ever met. Determined, unshaken, unstoppable. I know, he said simply. She smirked. You always did think you were right about everything. Shaq grinned. Because I usually am. She rolled her eyes. Uh-huh. Sure. 11:59 p.m. Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, placing it on the table. A single cupcake. With a candle. Natalie blinked. Of all the things she expected from this night, this wasn't one of them. You kept that? She asked, a little stunned. Shaq shrugged. Figured we should do it right this time. Natalie stared at the flickering candle, something thick rising in her throat. For years, birthdays had meant nothing to her. They were just reminders of time moving forward while she stayed stuck in place. But now, sitting on a rooftop with a man she had met less than 24 hours ago, who had somehow managed to change everything in one day, she finally felt like she was moving forward too. She took a breath, let the moment settle, and then, as the clock struck midnight, she blew out the candle. Some stories aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be felt. If this journey moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that kindness can change lives, then stay with us. Because there are more stories out there, more voices that deserve to be seen, heard, and lifted. And who knows? The next story might just be yours.